In around 1986, after I left General Dynamics and I began freelancing for a variety of different defense contractors, I received a call from Lockheed Martin. Well, actually, at that time, it was still Lockheed. And I was asked by a gentleman who worked at that facility to do some conceptual artwork of a new aircraft. It was referred to as the second generation in a family of aircraft that had been in deployment for quite some time. And at this time, you may have heard some of the rumors. There were these sonic booms coming over Southern California, and they were traveling at speeds that were something in the neighborhood of Mach 4, Mach 5. You could track the sonic boom by using earthquake sensors on the ground because it was that powerful and it was that fast. And all of this seemed like a big giveaway that there was something that had superseded the fastest aircraft that we knew of at the time, which was the SR-71 Blackbird. Now, there are a number of, number of aircraft. I'm just going to fast forward through some of this stuff here. There are a number of aircraft that, here we go. This is the XP-70. This is an aircraft that was built entirely of stainless steel. It has 6 huge engines buried in this in a cell that's under the center line of the aircraft. And aside from the SR-71 Blackbird, this particular aircraft had a capability somewhere in the vicinity of Mach 3, which was, I mean, so hot, so fast, I should say, that the leading edges of the wings would actually start to glow. And this is also true, of course, of the SR-71. Anyway, so I'm asked by these folks who cannot tell me what the second generation of this aircraft looks like to come up with something that looks really, really fast. And so I took this aircraft here and the SR-71 Blackbird, and I combined the features of the two aircraft, and I came up with something that looked approximately like this. When I went back to the facility and showed them this drawing, sans the little parasitic aircraft that's sitting on the back end there, they had brought in 2 engineers that were sitting across from me who I subsequently identified as 2 of the luminaries of Lockheed engineering. They were contemporaries of Ben Rich and was it Jack Kelly, or what was the other gentleman? Kelly Johnson. Sorry, just slipped my mind there for a second. Anyway, these gentlemen were contemporaries of this fellow, and so I laid out my sketch pad and I showed it to these gentlemen, and they both suddenly got this very nervous look on their faces. One actually got red in the face, and you could almost see the beads of perspiration beginning to form on his forehead, and his hands began to shake, and he was looking at my drawing, and he was saying, well, what are those canards doing on there? Those are the little wings in the front. Well, those will be torn off at Mach 7. And he started to say 17. Mach 17. Now, I'm not an aeronautical engineer, but I know that that's got to be something around 15,000 miles an hour or higher. But the funny thing is that after I explained to them what my thinking was about how this particular aircraft was kind of just a combination of the features that I found in 2 of the other aircraft that, you know, me and my simplicity knew about as an artist, you know, I felt that it was logical that they would have those kinds of features. And so they tried to dissuade me from believing that any of that was possible, that you could have these vertical stabilizers out on the wingtips, and that you could have canards or any of those kinds of things. And it wasn't more than about 4 years later that there was actually a near-miss collision with a commercial airliner flying near Edwards Air Force Base as an object, an aircraft that looked just like this was climbing out of Edwards Air Force Base. So then I understood why this gentleman became so upset, became so nervous. But in the process of discussing all the features of this aircraft and all the things that they wanted me to incorporate into the artwork that I did for them, which I have never seen since, it's still classified. But one of the things that this gentleman told me was, well, you know, we've had another version of this aircraft in operation for a number of years. Now remember, this is 1986, which means that we're right in the middle of the Reagan administration. And the timeline that I've picked up from other sources indicate that there was a development program for this first generation aircraft, which I later found to be the Aurora aircraft program, or family of aircraft, that this aircraft bore a striking resemblance to one of the things that Kelly Johnson had described as the hopeless diamond. Let's see here. Sorry to jump around like this. Okay. Yeah, I'm going in the wrong direction. I'm sorry. Pardon me. This is unrehearsed. Okay. This is what the aircraft, the first generation Aurora, looked like. And this is not by any means a great illustration, but at least it gives you the basic components of the system and how it worked. And it wasn't until years later that I even came across this information. In fact, this is a drawing that I did for Aviation Week in Space Technology because they began accumulating information themselves. But the aircraft, as it was described to me by this Lockheed employee, had been on a mission that was bringing it back to Edwards Air Force Base. And in the process of bringing this aircraft in, there are two different propulsion systems on this aircraft. One is a series of 4 engines that are embedded in the body of the aircraft, and you can kind of see the inlets and the exhausts that are the 4 nacoducts that are on either side, and then the 4 trapezoidal-shaped panels in the back that are just past the midline. But those were basically the inlets and the outlets of 4 big engines that would launch the thing from a runway, and that the aircraft would be brought up to something around Mach-2. And then the next step of this process was that line that you see that runs across the widest point of the fuselage is actually a line of what look like fuel injectors, but they're all pointing outward. And if you look at this in the side view, you can see that what happens is that when this thing gets up to a certain speed, you have the air flowing across the front of the aircraft and being compressed by the displacement of the aircraft at such a tremendous velocity that the entire aircraft would melt if it wasn't made out of space shuttle tiles, because the entire aircraft is covered with space shuttle tiles, the ceramic tiles that ablate the heat. But when the air rushes across the surface of the aircraft, it becomes so hot. All you have to do is just spray the fuel into the airstream, and boom, it blows up. And when it does, it expands between the supersonic shock wave that comes off of that ridge at the center of the aircraft and the tapered afterbody of the vehicle. So basically, it pinches the aircraft top and bottom, and it drives it forward at tremendous velocity. Now, when this fellow explained to me that there was an aircraft like this coming into Edwards Air Force Base, he indicated that this aircraft was in trouble and the pilot was having difficulty cycling from one propulsion system to the other, so he couldn't land it. So he was instructed to take it out over the ocean, and if he couldn't correct the problem, to just put it into the water and destroy it so that it would never be found. What he said was, the aircraft took 15 minutes to get from Edwards Air Force Base to Hawaii before he was able to turn around. Now, he must have thought, he's an artist, he doesn't know anything about engineering, blah, blah, blah. Well, if you can go, and I had gone scuba diving that year in Hawaii, so I knew it was 3,000 miles from Edwards Air Force Base. Well, if you can go 3,000 miles in 15 minutes, that means you're traveling at 12,000 miles an hour. And this was in 1986. So, and then the new drawing, the new thing that I was preparing for them was supposed to be capable of something in the area of 17,000 miles an hour. It's a tremendous velocity. It's a kind of velocity that you would normally associate with UFOs, and so it stands to reason that when you're outside late at night and you see a bright light zipping across the sky at, a seemingly very high velocity, it could be a satellite, or it could be one of these things. Because, in spite of everything they'll tell you about whether it's burning hydrogen or methane or this fuel or that fuel, the afterbody of the aircraft glows from the heat of the exhaust. Whether the fuel itself produces a bright flame that you can see is irrelevant, because the back end of this thing glows like a big ember of charcoal in a barbecue when it lights up. In fact, years later, a witness that had actually had a chance to walk under and around this aircraft had told me that they had decided to pulse the burst of fuel out of the back end of this aircraft because it was eroding the tiles on the tail end of this aircraft so severely and so quickly that it was just about ready to burn the tail end off the aircraft. So they would pulse it in 5-second intervals with a 10-second rest in between. Now, the transition between the internal jet engines and the external burning mechanism, which is very similar to what the military now calls a linear aerospike engine, except the entire back of the aircraft is just one big linear aerospike engine. But basically, the idea is that if you're transitioning from one propulsion system to the other, you're going to leave kind of an odd-looking contrail in the sky. And what does it look like? It looks like puffs of smoke rings around another contrail, or the donuts on a rope contrail that has been reported around Texas and other places early in the morning or late in the evening.
I'd written a couple of Aurora stories suggesting that the evidence was accumulating that something was out there. And I received in the mail a sketch and a note from a man named Chris Gibson.
This eyewitness is one of the best in the business. Chris Gibson was a member of Britain's Royal Observer Corps. He was part of their elite international recognition team, one of the top military aircraft observers in the world. One day, in 1989, while working on an oil rig in the North Sea, a colleague called Chris outside.
There was a formation of 4 aircraft. The lead aircraft was a KC-135 Stratotanker, and off its port side were 2 F-111 fighter bombers. Off the tail of the KC-135 Stratotanker was a black triangular aircraft that had no wings, no tail, a perfect triangle. And there's nothing that I've ever seen before looked like that, which was an unusual occurrence because I'm trained in instant recognition by the Royal Observer Corps. And if I didn't know what it was, it's not in any books.
This shape and the sonic booms told Bill Sweetman a great deal.
If you're looking at an aircraft that is designed to fly at what's loosely called hypersonic speeds, at 5 or 6 times the speed of sound or upwards, there are several things that become absolutely essential. One is that you require a very high degree of sweepback on the wing leading edges. Otherwise, you start getting into severe problems of drag and aerodynamic heating. As you go into this very slender shape, you still need to have a lot of volume in that shape for fuel, for propulsion, for crew. And the best way to provide that is to blend the wing and the body together. You get a very characteristic, highly blended triangular shape, which is, in plan view, identical to what Chris saw.
In Amarillo, Texas, Steve Douglas may have captured photographic evidence of the aurora. He maintains sophisticated military signals monitoring equipment in his home.
I think it was March 23rd, 1992. I was back here in my office when the house was shook by what sounded like a large sonic boom. I'd heard a lot of sonic boom before, so I know how they sound, but this one seemed to continue. It wasn't just a crack boom and left. It was a rather large shudder that you could feel in your chest, and the windows vibrated. And that's when I saw this very high-speed aircraft flying over the house at incredible rates. I grabbed my camera, knowing it was something different, especially because of the way the contrail worked.
The Donuts on a Rope contrail is produced by no conventional aircraft. Its engine noise is also unique.
It's a deep, thrumming, regular, pulsing, booming noise, like somebody unzipping the sky. You feel it more in your chest than you hear it. It doesn't sound like a jet. It doesn't sound like a rocket. It's just very unique and an amazing sound.
The Donuts on a Rope contrail has been reported from around the world. This never-before-seen footage was taken by an amateur cameraman from a transatlantic passenger jet. It is very hard to hide an aircraft like the Aurora. Steve switched on his radios. On a military frequency reserved for spy satellites, he heard the call sign, Dark Star.
Dark Star Sierra Formation Crew. Dark Star Sierra Formation Crew. Dark Star Sierra Formation Crew.
Dark Star Sierra Formation.
Be advised for that. Dark Star Sierra, out.
I'd never heard Dark Star before, and I keep lists of thousands of call signs.
The contrail and engine noise are the signature of a pulsed detonation engine, the kind of engine necessary to fly at hypersonic speeds. With a cruising speed of 5,300 miles per hour, Mach-8, operating in near orbit at an altitude of 50 to 80 miles, the Aurora could reach anywhere in the world in 3 hours.
And it's generally that point where the internal engines are propelling it up to speed, and then the outside burning mechanism was pulsing, and it would leave a little burst of, like a smoke ring at intervals. Now, I've seen this thing actually fly over the area where I live in Northern California, in Redding, and I begin to wonder, you know, if, according to the eyewitnesses that I spoke to, who've actually been close enough to touch this thing, and it's very difficult to see from this drawing here, but right up near the nose of this aircraft are two large, what appear to be mirrored balls, like the lawn ornaments they have in the northeastern United States. Don't ask me why they put these things out there, but they look very much like an infrared seeker head, which is it's a cryogenically cooled sensing device, except in the instance of these things, they have two of them. And each of those infrared sensors can actually see an infrared image, just like you can see with your eyes, except that this sees an infrared. Now, the different witnesses that I've spoken to have told me this particular aircraft is probably one of the largest remotely piloted vehicles ever built, and there were probably as many as 18 to 20 of these built, from what I've been told. And the interesting thing about this is this was all done on the QT. This wasn't ever discussed, as far as I know, with the Soviets when they were talking about their strategic arm limitation talks between Reagan and Gorbachev and this kind of thing. In fact, if you go back to the meetings that they had in Reykjavik in 1986, and you look at the film of those time frames, when Reagan shows up, he has this expression of apprehension and maybe a little bit of fear. And Gorbachev looks absolutely incensed as he's climbing out of his limousine to go into the talks. And after 2 days of these talks, they come back out, and the expressions are reversed. It's now Reagan who has a totally different demeanor, actually one of maybe relief and joy. We've reached an agreement. And it's now Gorbachev who has the look and the expression of fear and apprehension. What's my information? That this thing was in deployment from at least 1982 to 83 and was flying over the Soviet Union completely unscathed and untouched in 1986, about the time that Gorbachev and these people got together. Well, the story goes that during this meeting, Reagan actually sort of lifted the edge of the tent up and let the camel stick its nose under there to see what we really have, or at least discuss some of what we have. And it was so appalling to Gorbachev when he found out exactly how much further advanced we were than the Soviet Union. I think he finally decided that it was economically in the best interest of the Soviet Union to begin declaring policies of glasnost and perestroika, and they probably even promised him that he'd get a Nobel Peace Prize out of it, which, of course, he did. So it makes you wonder, what are all the things going on behind the scenes? Now, let's see here. November 12th, 1988. I had, at that time, recently become reacquainted with a friend of mine from college, from Art Center, and we found that we had a lot of common interests, one of which was advanced technology aircraft. On November 12th of 1988, there was going to be an air show held out of Norton Air Force Base in San Bernardino. It's now decommissioned from what I understand. But this base had a number of defense contractors that were housed right on the base. I think TRW, Ford Aerospace, there were several other companies, Lockheed. They all had facilities on this base, and they did a lot of analysis and testing and things of this nature. Now, several sources since then, Philip Corso in his book The Day After Roswell and some other places, have all confirmed that there were things going on at Norton Air Force Base that were really kind of outside the normal purview of experimentation and research that you would expect at other places like Edwards Air Force Base, even though later on we find that Edwards Air Force Base was up to its eyebrows in this kind of thing too. But this friend of mine and I knew about this air show that was going to be happening at Norton Air Force Base, so we decided that we were going to rendezvous out there and see the SR-71, maybe do a flyby and some other aircraft. And a week later, I was unable to attend because a friend of mine had called me up and asked me to do some artwork for a magazine. And it had to be done over the weekend, so I was unable to attend. But the following week, I contacted my friend. We'll just call him Brad for the sake of this discussion. I called up Brad, and Brad seemed, there was something wrong. I just couldn't tell what it was. And I said, well, what's going on, Brad? I mean, you don't sound like you're real excited about the air show. And I mean, did you see something interesting? And he says, well, actually, I think I saw some things I wasn't supposed to see. And I said, well, how is that possible? Anything that they put out on the flight line or in the hangars is for public display. He says, well, that's not what I'm talking about. He said, one of the fellows that I went to this air show with was a fellow who used to be involved with the Pentagon. So, one of the undersecretaries of defense in some department there. But the fellow was retired, multimillionaire, very wealthy, and he was one of Brad's clients. And Brad was a designer. And his intent was to put me together with this gentleman, and maybe we could network some jobs. So, right in the middle of the air show, right about the time that right about the time that the, doggone it. Excuse me for just a second here. Right about the time that this air show, and this is an article about the air show on that particular date, was supposed to begin with the Thunderbirds flying their flying demonstration display for the public. This gentleman turns to my friend and says, follow me. And they go over to a big hangar at the west end of the field, and they're met there by some security personnel who suggest that they need to show some ID, and this fellow that my friend was with passed him off as his personal aide. And so in they went. They get on the Air Force version of a 727, I think it was, and they fly up to Plant 42 in Palmdale, where Lockheed Skunk Works is. And they walk into the Skunk Works building. This is Norton Air Force Base. This is the hangar. This is, of course, many of the buildings that would have been in the foreground have since been demolished, but this is the large hangar that they walked into initially. This is the Lockheed Skunk Works as it appears today. This is a view of the facility from, I would say that looks like it's from the southern face of the facility. It's easily 500,000 to 750,000 square feet inside the hangar. It's a huge hangar. And you can kind of tell by the size of the doors there below just to the right of where the Lockheed Martin logo is. But so they were flowing up to this hangar, and as soon as they walked into the hangar, this gentleman turns to Brad and says, there are some things in here that you're not supposed to see, that I wasn't told were going to be part of this show. And so just keep your mouth shut. We'll leave. We'll be out of here just as soon as we can, but just don't talk to anybody. Well, in the course of the show, sitting there in the hangar is that first generation Aurora, the one that's shaped like a flat dial football shape. And sure enough, the tiles on the tail end of it are all severely eroded, discolored from the heat. One of the things that Brad finds when he walks into this thing is that it has 121 circular ports in the tiles on the bottom of the aircraft. And it turns out that there's a lieutenant colonel just a few feet away talking to some female members of Congress or the Senate, some different political people who had security classifications for these kinds of things. And he's explaining how each one of these circular tiles represents a vertical launch tube, each one of which carries a fully armed nuclear reentry vehicle, a single cone-shaped MIRV. Except that this aircraft carries 121 of them, all packed into this nice little honeycomb-type arrangement in the belly of the aircraft. So you can imagine if there's 18 or 20 of these aircraft and each one of them have 121 nuclear reentry vehicles or the capability of carrying that much, it represents an entirely different strategic threat to the rest of the world. I mean, it's great for us, but in a way, it makes you wonder, what are the Soviets being told? I mean, are they really being informed about this behind our backs? The public and the the U.S. citizenry doesn't even know about this stuff, but they're talking about it with Gorbachev. It just doesn't seem right to me. Anyhow, in the course of this display at Lockheed Skunk Works, there are a number of other aircraft, one of which is the losing prototype in the B-2 stealth bomber competition. And this thing was the funkiest looking aircraft you can imagine. It looked a little bit like the aircraft that was shown in the Honda commercial about we have our own black projects for the release of the, I think it was the Honda CRX, little hatchback. But this particular aircraft, as it's been explained to me, was like a flying wing, except that it had a boom that extended out from the tail a considerable distance, and it had a little V-shaped tail on the bottom of it. And the back end of this boom would articulate and turn just like the tail of a real bird when it's, changing its direction of flight. Very interesting, but wasn't something that the Department of the Air Force thought very highly of. And so ultimately Northrop wound up getting the B-2 bomber contract. Now, the other part of this story is that a little while later, they part this curtain, and here are 3 flying saucers in this hangar at Skunk Works. And they're each hovering off the floor, several feet above the floor. No landing gear underneath, no cables supporting them from above. And just sort of floating. You can see them sort of moving around, almost like they're floating on the water, like a ship at the harbor. And he said that there were 3 different sizes. There was the smallest one was, his original estimate was about 16 feet. Now, let's see. This was Brad's first marker drawing of what he saw. This represents the smallest of the 3, which I eventually determined using basic drafting techniques that the actual diagram, or the actual diameter at the base of this structure, this vehicle, was about 24 feet in diameter. And the reason I can tell that is because he was sure that the crew compartment, the sphere that's in the middle, was 12 feet in diameter. And if you think about sticking 4 ejection seats, in the upper half of that sphere, and having enough room to move around inside there, it starts to come together. He knew that the sides were sloped at about 35 degrees, so if you take a 12-foot diameter sphere, about a 2.5-inch or 2.5-foot wide ledge on the flanks of the sphere, and then the slope, you bring it out, it works out to 24 feet in diameter. And using other techniques to map out what the circumference and what the width degree-wise of each of these sections, these stacks of plates in the bottom, which are referred to as capacitors. I eventually came up with this drawing. Now, it wasn't until later that I put in the call-outs that explain what each of these things are, what the different components are in this system. But I made a blueprint of this drawing, and I sent it to my friend Brad. And then I called him up a couple of days on the phone. I said, "Did you get the blueprint?" He says, "Yes, I did." He says, "Mark, I'm only going to tell you this once. This has got to be the most dangerous illustration you've ever done, because this exactly matches what I saw. This is every aspect of it, the size, the shape, the relative position of the components, everything. That's the way it looked." And he says, "If you're smart, you'll tear this thing up and throw it away, and you'll never talk about it again, because you're going to be in big trouble if you go public with this." And he was right. I had all kinds of problems. But I didn't really go public with it until years later, when I started getting confirmation of this system from other sources. I became aware of this propulsion technology, and it was referred to as the alien reproduction vehicle. So the first thing you think, of course, is that it's a back-engineered system, that it's designed and built, it's based on something that we recovered in a crash, say Roswell or something like that. And so with the electronics background that I had from the Air Force, the school that I went to, the engineering that I saw when I was working for different defense contractors, I began asking questions. I'd go to work for Allied Signal, and we'd be talking about the space shuttle and some engineering, and I'd say, "Well, what do you know about advanced capacitors and lifting things with capacitors?" And this one fellow, Roger Turner, was an engineer there, and he says, "Well, yeah, you can do that. It's called the Biefeld-Brown effect." There were these 2 scientists, and they found that if you put a lot of voltage at a high frequency on some parallel plate capacitors with a nice, like a glass or a nice plastic or silicon dielectric, that's the stuff in between the plates, the conductors. If you put an electrical charge on those plates, that it'll levitate. And so then we began looking at this and began to realize that if you can control the amount of current that goes to each one of those sections, that you can basically control how much current there is on one side of it. You can make it turn and bank, just like a helicopter, like the swash plate that controls the amount of cutting into the air that a helicopter has when it's banking and turning. But you do it all electronically. Well, I said, well, how do you know this really works? I mean, you know, isn't it just some science fiction thing? He says, oh, no. He says, I had a buddy who went to school. He was a metallurgy student at University of Arizona in Tucson. His name was Mach-15, I believe it was. And he decided that he was going to try something like this. He heard about the Biefeld-Brown effect, and he went out and he got some sheets of glass, and he put some copper plates in between them, and glass, copper, and then he sealed the edges, and he had a wire going into each plate from opposite sides. He ran them to a power supply, high voltage, low amps, high frequency, kind of a spiked sawtooth wave, as they would call it. And the thing actually floated, and everybody was startled by this. Everybody in the whole metallurgy department heard about it. Before you knew it, news began to spread like wildfire. Well, it was only 2 days later, some guys in suits show up at the college. And they call all these students into kind of an assembly, and they say, basically, this is classified. You will not talk about it. If you do, you will be prosecuted. End of story. Don't talk about it. And I don't know that it happened, but I'm sure that there's a good possibility that they were asked to sign some kind of non-disclosure agreement as well. Now this was probably, the story I heard was in the late 1980s, early 1990s, after I began to research this kind of thing. And so going back a number of years, sort of backtracking time-wise, I'm figuring that this story involving the fellow at the University of Arizona in Tucson probably occurred somewhere in the mid-1980s. Now, the more I begin to investigate this, you know, your imagination starts, you know, well, where can I see one? You know, where can I go and watch? And so I began doing just that. I would go and I would hang out in the mountains that kind of overlooked the Edwards Dry Lake area. I would go up to Wrightwood and I would find a location just beyond the ski resort where you could go out to this sort of a prominence, and you could sit there and you could watch the whole high desert basin with binoculars on a clear night and see every bit of it. And you could see stuff. You could see things that would light up, zip across the sky, stop, and then go out. Or you'd see things that would do this, brightly illuminated, like a meteor. And you know, for all intents and purposes, if you were uneducated about, you know, what meteors really look like, you would think, oh, I was a meteor, no big deal. But then if you can get it on film, some of which I did, you begin to realize that these aren't meteors at all. This is actually the manifestation of some kind of advanced propulsion system that uses extremely high voltages of electricity. And what happens is that when you put a tremendous amount of electricity on a system like this, it begins to charge the air around the vehicle. It actually begins to ionize the air. When basically an ion is just an atom that has an extra amount of electrical charge to it. And so its polarity becomes fixed according to the atom, you know, what kind of material it is, and that sort of thing, nitrogen, oxygen. But anyway, ions will glow because when they stabilize, when the charge is dissipated, it's given off as a photon. So you see it. It'll glow. It'll illuminate. And so when these things fire up the power and they create this bright, intense point of light, and I've seen everything from a deep bluish green all the way up to something that was so intensely white with kind of a blue halo around it. It was like looking at an arc welder's cherry as he's busy welding steel together. The funny thing about it, though, is that even though it was seemingly that bright, it didn't hurt your eyes to look at it. I mean, it hurt even less than to look at this light that they've got pointed at me right now. So you have to understand that there's something going on there that involves extremely powerful energy. And so one of the things that occurred to me was that if you have an energy source that can perform these kinds of capabilities, do these kinds of things, make these unusual terms, accelerate at blinding speed, there has to be other things going on that are really sort of beyond what we think of in terms of normal physics. And I was just absolutely driven by my curiosity to try and figure out what made these things go. Now, there have been lots of other incidences. In 1993, I was going to the post office in Rialto, and I came across a pickup truck that had a B-2 bomber production facility sticker on one corner of the bumper, and the other corner had a picture of a flying saucer that says, "They're here." So I waited. And the fellow came out, and I said, "Are they really?" And he says, "Yes, but I really can't tell you about it." And I said, "Well, let me tell you what I know." So I told him some of these stories and tried to encourage him. And this is something that any of you can do, is if you see someone you think has seen something, or you know someone you think has seen something, to try and encourage them to be open and talk about it, because this is the best way you can find for developing leads. I found more leads just engaging people in conversation about things that they feel reluctant to talk about, because most people will ridicule and make fun of them. But this fellow turns to me and he says, "I work at the Northrop B-2 bomber production facility." And he says, "Since they passed this new law that you cannot smoke inside a federal facility," he says, "they've put up some picnic benches outside, and we have to go outside on a smoke break every couple hours if we want a cigarette." So he said, as you probably know, the Northrop facility is right at the opposite end of the Plant 42 complex from Lockheed Skunk Works. And so here we are in the middle of summer of 1992. He says, "I work the graveyard shift, and it's about 1:45. And he says, all of the lights around the complex are extinguished. And we see the sheriff's deputies come up and they block off all the surrounding streets. And we know that when that happens, it means that there's a classified aircraft of one kind or another that's going to come in and land at the complex." Now, I got a ticket in that area not too long ago, well, a few years after that. And so I had occasion to talk to one of the sheriff's deputies. And I said, "Do you guys really do that? Do you really block off the..." "Yes, we do." "And do you see stuff like what I'm about to tell you?" And he said, "Yes, they do." Well, what he tells me is that they noticed that the big bypass doors on the eastern face of the Lockheed Skunk Works complex, the building, this huge hangar that I showed you the photograph earlier, that they're wide open and there are just a few lights on inside. It's just a dull glow. But they can see all of these strange little, they look like these little, it's a little self-propelled platform that the linemen use to work on electrical power lines. And it's like a little tractor with wheels, and it has an arm that comes up with a basket on the end of it. And the guy can stand in the basket with these little controls, and he can move the arm all around so he can work on the power lines. But they've got like a dozen of these things in a circle, sitting outside of the Lockheed Skunk Works. And hanging from each one of these baskets, which are up in the air like this, is this tarp, this one continuous tarp that goes from one basket to the next, to the next, to the next, makes a big, like a cylinder that stretches all the way to the ground. He says, we're sitting there trying to figure out, what the heck are they doing down there? And then he realized that because it was the summertime and because the smog was blowing up into the high desert, and you probably know this because you live in this area, that at night, when there's a lot of light pollution from the local city lights, street lights, the smog tends to glow a dull orange. And it kind of illuminates the whole sky. And he said that silhouetted against this orange sky was this big, black, lens-shaped flying saucer hovering about 500 feet above this cluster of vehicles. Now, this is where I make the connection between the black saucer that I mentioned earlier. So here's this flying saucer hovering above this group of vehicles. And out of the midst of this group of vehicles comes a man with a large handheld spotlight, kind of a blue-green spotlight. And he flashes it at this vehicle 3 times as it silently hovers there. No jet noise, no fluttering of the tarp or anything. And this object has 3 lights on the bottom, and he flashes those lights 3 times, and then it slowly descends into this cluster of vehicles. The arms all extend out into the center of this thing, and then the entire group of vehicles, as one unit, trundles into the hangar. The doors close, all the lights on the facility come on, the sheriff's deputies leave. So he said, I smoked a lot of cigarettes after that. And he said, my persistence was rewarded about a week later when the process reversed itself. The sheriffs show up, they block off the streets, the hangar doors open, this bundle of vehicles comes trundling out. The arms come up like this. A man comes out of the midst with a big flash spotlight. And after about 15 minutes, this object slowly rises out of the midst of these vehicles to about 500 feet. And he said, the fellow on the ground flashes it 3 times. The object in the sky flashes 3 times. And he says, then this thing went from the far end of Plant 42, past me and disappeared in the dark in less than a second and a half, just like that, silently. No sonic boom, no jet noise, nothing. And he says, then I knew. He says, then I absolutely knew that we had captured whatever that bizarre other half of the physics is that we don't know anything about. Somebody figured it out. And so, in a nutshell, the reason that these vehicles are able to do the things that they're doing, the reason they're able to make these incredible maneuvers, is because they have found a way to cancel their own mass. Now, for the layman, think of it as their weight. They can cancel their own weight. Now, in physics, and I'm only going to use a minimal amount of technical terms for you, but in physics there is an energy form that's embedded in the space-time around us everywhere. This particular energy is referred to in a number of different terms. It's called scalar energy, zero-point energy, quantum zero-point fluctuations of the vacuum. But basically, where it gets its name from, in the early research that discovered this particular energy form, they were, in the beginning, when they first began to discover how to make cryogenic fluids like liquid nitrogen or liquid argon and things like this, they would take these super-cooled fluids and they would then try to determine whether there was anything going on in these materials that they were cooling down to these extreme temperatures. Now, one of the things that happens when there's any kind of energy or warmth is you get all the molecules moving all around. It's called Brownian motion. But when you reduce something down to near absolute zero, where there is none of this Brownian motion at all, where everything just kind of stops moving because there's no heat energy left, there's still this charge. There's still this vibration in the material, and that's where it gets the name, zero-point energy, because it's something they find near absolute zero. And so the conclusions that have been made in the years since this was discovered is that zero-point energy is really sort of the power source for the entire universe. We talk about the law of entropy in thermodynamics, and that's basically the idea that if you heat something up, it cools down because the heat dissipates. If you energize something, the charge dissipates. It goes away. It diffuses. It becomes less because it's dissipated into the environment. But the one thing that sticks out and is different from all of that is matter itself. Now, Einstein said that matter can neither be created nor destroyed. You can be changed to energy, and you can change energy to matter if you know how to do it. But if you look at an atom, if you were able to hold an atom and blow it up so you could see it, so it was this big, and you could see the electrons spinning all around the nucleus, the protons and the neutrons and the electrons and everything moving. It's all in motion all the time, and it never slows down, ever. It never stops. Now, to me, that sounds like perpetual motion. We all know that's impossible, right? Well, it's not. And this is the thing, because this energy form that seems to boil up right out of another dimension is what keeps all those subatomic particles in motion all the time. That's where they get the power from. But it is that motion that creates the effect of mass. Now, people think, well, it has a certain mass and always stays the same. Well, no, that's not true. Mass is a variable effect. Now, Einstein said that when you accelerate through space-time, your mass increases. But most people don't sit back and say, well, why? Why does it do that? Mass increases because as you travel through the environment, the atoms of your vehicle interact at a higher rate with this energy that's embedded in the environment. And so in a sense, the electrons and the subatomic particles all become more and more energized because their interaction, their absorption of this energy increases. But when you decelerate, it's all dissipated again. Everything goes back to its normal mass. So we can see that this particular physical characteristic is a variable. It changes according to what's going on with the object. Okay. Now, we know this energy is out there. We can prove that it exists. And we know that it's responsible for the effect of mass. And Einstein said that you could never propel something up to and beyond the speed of light, because as you approach the speed of light, the mass begins to increase exponentially until it reaches nearly an infinite mass. You could never have enough propulsive power to accelerate, continue accelerating past the speed of light. And so everyone in physics, in the physics world, said, well, this is the reason why aliens could never be coming here from another world, because there's just no way they could reach the speed of light. They'd have to spend 12, 13 lifetimes just to get here from another star. Okay. Well, we know that you can absorb energy out of the environment and turn it into electricity because we have photovoltaic cells, solar cells, right? You can get sunlight, you can produce electricity. Well, suppose you found a way to take this zero-point energy right out of the environment as you're moving along. No fuel involved. You just absorb it out of the environment and you put it to work. So energy is conserved and no physical laws are broken. But if you can take that energy out of the environment and use it for propulsive force, the other thing that happens is that because it's being absorbed into your propulsion system through a mechanism like this, it's not left in the environment to interact with the material structure of your craft. And so what happens is the electrons and the subatomic particles, they start to slow down. All those strong and weak nuclear forces that hold everything together are still there, but the spin has slowed down. And in a sense, the material structure of the atom, the atoms throughout the entire vehicle, are slightly de-energized, as though the atoms were experiencing deceleration. But what's happening? You're using this energy to go faster. But the beauty of this is that as you go faster and faster, it means you have more and more of the energy you can draw from. And as you're doing so, the relative mass, the relative weight of your vehicle is being reduced further and further and further. So you're getting lighter and lighter the faster you go, and you have more and more energy to keep propelling yourself. And so in the end, what happens is you have a way of breaking the light speed barrier because you don't have to worry about anything growing in its mass, in the level of mass it has. Now, this is how I kind of explained it in my own mind, not having the ability to do all the physics equations. And I ran this whole idea past Hal Puthoff in a paper that I called The Feasibility of Interstellar Travel. And he sent me back a message saying that he felt that it was a tour de force on how this might be possible. So I went the next step, and I said, okay, well, if that's true, if you can demass or mass cancel an object so that it has none of the effects of mass, that means that there aren't any g-forces. Now, when I took these media orientation rides with the military, and traded paintings for rides in F-16s and F-15s and things like this with the military, I had a chance to put on a G-suit and experience 7 Gs in an F-15, 9.3 Gs in F-16. And I can tell you that when your body follows an aircraft through an acceleration where it makes a sudden turn, your body basically wants to keep going straight, as like everything else in the aircraft. But the wings are so powerful they can turn the aircraft with such force that your body experiences up to 9.3 times its normal body weight. So I weigh 200 pounds, or at least I used to. That means that I would weigh almost 1,800 pounds sitting there in that ejection seat. And believe me, it starts to hurt. These fellows, most of them have necks like somebody from the WWF Wrestling League. I mean, honestly. And in fact, any good F-16 pilot will tell you that there's only two kinds of F-16 pilots. The ones that have messed up necks and the ones that are going to. Because they put those kind, I mean, imagine if your head weighs 10 pounds and you pull 9 Gs. It's like your head weighs 90 pounds. It's like having a 90-pound kid hanging off your head. For those of you who are parents, you can understand and appreciate that. So I had the ability to experience this kind of thing, and I can tell you that the idea of making right-angle turns at 9,000 miles an hour, and I've personally seen this right here in Southern California. In fact, that particular sighting was 2 days after this event that occurred with the dogs howling and not being able to move. 2 days later, on the 13th, I was out on a date with my sweetheart. And just to give you an idea of how understanding she is, our anniversary was actually on December 11th, the night that I spent over at this abductee's house. And so 2 days later, we go out to celebrate this anniversary. And we leave the Ontario airport, the Red Line Inn where we had originally met, and we go up and we're sitting at the light on the overcrossing of I-10, which I think might be Vineyard Avenue, I'm not sure. But anyway, we're sitting at the light. It's a full moon. We're facing north, so you can see Mount Baldy, and it's, because it's December, there's snow on all the mountains, so everything's very clear, even though it's dark. And right in the middle of just sitting there at the light, this brilliant bluish-white bulb of light zips in from the southeast, drops down in front of the mountains, makes a right-angle turn, goes about 5 miles west, then makes another right-angle turn and goes up through Chaco Canyon, which goes right up near Mount Baldy. And this all happened in like a second and a half. And it was, a couple of days later, I went and I measured the distances, and I figured that according to how fast this occurred and the distance travel, it had to be somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 miles an hour. No sound, absolutely silent. And it was flawless. I mean, there was never a moment where it slowed down or anything, just like that. And wouldn't you know it, I look over and say, "Did you see that? Did you see that?" And she's right in the middle of a yawn and missed the whole thing. The one time that I could have proved that my passion, and she's yawning and missed it. So, and that's probably happened to some of you too. I mean, you have these observations and you see these startling and unusual things, and then you look to someone to kind of validate your sighting, and you find that they were either asleep or yawning or, taking a drink. For any of you who've watched Star Trek and some of these other science fiction TV shows and things, you're probably familiar with the idea of space warp, warping space, time warps. Well, I've actually had occasion to see this particular phenomenon. I've had it described to me as appearing as though the sky is distorted and pulls back into a kind of tunnel, and then something would come out of it, stop momentarily, and then fly away. Now, that particular description was given to me by a scientist who works at JPL. And he was at White Sands during a test of some kind of weapon system when they actually saw this particular event. And it happened twice in the same location. This distortion in the sky. I mean, even the appearance of the clouds and everything kind of gets sucked back up into this looks like an inverted funnel. It goes up to a dark spot with little stars in it. And this thing comes almost like a dot, comes out of it, and all of a sudden it's a flying saucer sitting right there, and then it goes away. It comes back a little while later, this manifestation of this wormhole reappears, and it goes up into the wormhole. Now, in 1993, right before I moved to Northern California, I went to an Angels baseball game in Anaheim with some kids from the neighborhood. We were riding in a car. I was in the front seat next to the young fellow who was driving. And I don't know why this happens, but the subject of UFOs came up. And we were talking about UFOs, and this one young fellow said that he thought he'd seen one. And there was a Santa Ana winds condition at the time, and so the planes that were landing at the Ontario airport were circulating in kind of that strange pattern where they have to come in and land from, I guess it's the west end of the field, whereas normally they would come in from the east. But because of the wind direction, they had to change that, and they were in this orbiting pattern. And I mentioned casually in passing, it's amazing that those pilots are able to do all that stuff and never collide or have a collision, mid-air collision. All of a sudden, no sooner had I said this, there's a brilliant flash of light in the sky right over the airport. And out of that brilliant flash comes this glowing ball of light that got bigger and bigger and bigger as it descended. And I thought, oh my God, there's been a crash. And right behind it were these glowing, what I thought were glowing embers of debris that were following this thing down, but it was moving much more slowly than you would expect. And usually, if you've ever seen film footage of an aircraft that's been in a collision or crashed or has been shot down by a missile or something, you see bits and pieces of flaming debris, and there'll be flame and smoke and all this kind of stuff, and they go all over the place. But what was unusual about this event was that all of these glowing objects that were behind this thing that materialized in the sky were like parallel lines that moved without changing in position to one another. They were like parallel lines that all moved together in unison with this thing. Some of them were thick line weights, some were pencil thin, some were really quite large, but they were all sort of a golden yellow color. And they all sort of emerged from this one point in the sky. It was almost like there was an opening, and these things came out of the opening. I mean, one minute it's not there, the next minute it sort of just comes right out of it. And I was looking at this for the longest time, and I was trying to figure out what did I just see? This thing descends behind a distant hill. And then I remembered that there is this nature preserve I believe it's southwest of the Chino airfield. And they keep the place all closed up at night. They don't allow any people driving through there. It's all closed off to the public after dark. And that's exactly where this thing came down. And I had heard that there had been sightings in the area. So then I thought, well, maybe this was a UFO. And then when I thought of all of the other facts that had come to me over the years, it occurred to me that what I was seeing was an object that was just emerging from hyperspace. You know, because it was dark, I didn't see the distortion of the cloud and the skies and so forth. But then I had to try and explain, why are these parallel lines behind it? Now, if you remember the first Star Wars film, if you've ever seen a film like that, where they talk about making the jump to hyperspace, and they go off into this point in the sky where they begin to exceed the speed of light, you see all of the stars begin to become these long streaming lines that all radiate from the point that they're traveling towards. And they all become really bright, brilliant white. Well, if you know anything about the Doppler effect, and you know about light, one of the reasons they think that the universe is expanding is because the stars that are out there seem to be moving away from us, and when they do, the light frequency shifts towards the red. It's called the red shift. Okay, well, if you're traveling from a distant spot in the universe and you pop out of hyperspace in the Earth's atmosphere, and there's this same tunneling effect like the Navigator or the B-52 talked about, then it seemed like a perfect explanation to me that what I was seeing was a number of stars that the images had been streaked, just like at the initiation of the process, so also at the tail end of it. And the reason that the white light of the stars is a golden color is because it's red shifted towards a different frequency. And that's why all of these lines that I saw moved in unison as this thing descended. I mean, they did not change in relative position to one another at all. And that was the explanation I came up with. So that's pretty much everything I have.
So when you begin to hear that beginning from the 40s until not that long ago, there were multiple crash retrievals of these objects, it wasn't because these interstellar civilizations they're running around with IQs of 400 to 600. So I'm like a Down syndrome child. And but they're very advanced. They were running into the deployment of these systems. And they were based all over, and they began to be based all over the planet. And by the 1960s, they had successfully propagated those around the globe in enough locations covertly that they could track and target an extraterrestrial vehicle, hit it, and have it become disabled. Now, obviously, not every ET object that appears has that happen, so it's not like it happens every nanosecond, but it has happened dozens and perhaps hundreds of times. I met with an officer in the Air Force, in the Army, who was at Fort Huachuca out here in Arizona, Army Intelligence Headquarters, who had been in an underground facility in the 70s where there were 9 extraterrestrial vehicles and autopsy bodies that were in storage there. So, and that's just one facility, and that was 40-some years ago. Fort Huachuca. It's near Tombstone, ironically, Arizona. So these facilities began to be developed that are all underground, and they were studying the extraterrestrial material. That operation was very separate from the conventional, let's call it, extraordinary anti-gravity research going on in other operations. There are very few points of contact. So this is where you get into a complex understanding of TSSCI, Top Secret Special Compartmented Information or Intelligence. And the compartmentalization is very, very specific. And there could be people working on, say, gravity control systems for the Lockheed Skunk Works, but they weren't allowed to talk to and didn't know anything about the people studying the extraterrestrial materials, but there would be a few points of contact that would bridge it over. All right? but very few, very tightly compartmented. That's how that is structured. And I have had the privilege of interviewing people who've worked on both sides. Now, when you begin to consider then, we've had over 60 years, 62 years, and trillions of dollars in black budget unacknowledged special access funding, USAP, unacknowledged special access, completely black, funding of this kind of research and development, both on extraterrestrial material and on other conventional, and the then augmentation of the conventional anti-gravity human with the extraterrestrial studied material, you can begin to realize that what's out there that humans control is fearsome and awesome. And unfortunately, to the lay person or to the average general, admiral, or president, is indistinguishable from an extraterrestrial object in their mind. So that is really the danger point. That is where you have the risk of you being able to take these objects that are 100% man-made and, for example, this boomerang flying object seen through around the Hudson Valley, I believe this one, and the Hudson Valley events and the reported up and down, I think it was 88, something like that. And people got right up underneath it. Look what's underneath. Can you see that? Little tubes and structures and grids and what have you. That's not extraterrestrial. That's man-made. Probably out of the Boeing Phantom Works out of Seattle. And they were just seeing what the public would do. So people were stopped on the freeway reporting it. Tens of thousands of people saw these. Silent. A little bit of a humming sound, like a transformer. 100% man-made. 100% fooled everyone looking at it. Thought it was E.T. This is what I'm saying. The false flag's already happened. But they've been beta testing the system with these kinds of events. Another one that was reported are the big flying triangles, 200-300 feet across. Remember these? Belgium, other places. Look underneath. So these have been reported, and they have a grid structure, very manufactured, very man-made. Silent, except for a little bit of a humming sound when you're close. Electromagnetogravitics, floats along. Now, here's another layer of confusion that I didn't get a chance to share this with Mr. Schratt. There are extraterrestrial objects that look like and approximate the man-made ones. Now, you want to get a little more confused. Consider that if there's an extraterrestrial event that happens, they will then put up a man-made one, and they'll hoax a man-made event piggybacking on an extraterrestrial one, just to really confuse the picture. And that's happened many, many times. And there's a plethora of these that are very strange looking. This is another one. You see the structure? It's reported in a case. Now, Mr. Schratt has collected the best eyewitness documents of these at close range from people and then done models and drawings and what have you, and they're excellent. And these are all man-made. Now, to anyone who would casually see this, and then objects that were very similar to what was seen in the Phoenix lights, these sort of objects. You know, a fraction of a mile across. Also, can be, not always are, can be human man-made ones. If I'm confusing you, I apologize. But I think the nuance of this can't be lost anymore. We can't be simplistic and, frankly, stupid. And that's why when you have these wonderful renditions that he's done. Here's another one I showed earlier. And this one. And this is a wonderful You can zoom in on this one because someone got up beneath, close enough to this to see the structure under this anti-gravity system. Man-made also. So there's an entire history of aerospace research and development that's now 62 years on, using technologies that are having to do with mass cancellation, anti-gravity. And those have been deployed purposely so that people, it'll get into the media and thousands of people will see it, and it will either hide an extraterrestrial event and overwhelm it, or it will simply be a way of them testing the system to see what will the people say, what will the media say, how are they going to react, and then they can refine their algorithm, their protocol for how to do the hoax down the road. This is how they refine the false flag over a 60-year period. Now, one of the people who you all have heard of, I'm sure, who was the Lockheed Skunk Works head for years until he passed away, is Ben Rich. And, you know, I have people who are at meetings with him where he confirmed that we had things that could, quote, take E.T. home. And he also acknowledged that every point in space and time is connected to every other one through consciousness, and that telepathy, as it's commonly called, is real, etc. But Ben Rich may not have had all full access up to that level. And in some letters that we have, courtesy of Mr. Schratt, and these are, I just laid eyes on these today. I have a letter, Lockheed Advanced Aeronautics, to a gentleman, to Mr. John Andrews. He says, and the first letter that was written to him was, do you think that the UFOs are real, and et cetera, and so on. And he says, in response to your letter, I am a believer. So is Kelly Johnson, who of course, was the U-2 spy plane. With regards to another gentleman's comment, I do not believe any Lockheed person could or would have made that commitment. Rest easy. Anyway, and it's signed Ben Rich, July 8, 1986. And so in this, the letter, he asked for a clarification. And he says, did you mean UFOs as in man-made or extraterrestrial? And Ben Rich, the head of the very famous Lockheed Skunk Works, says, Dear John, this is the July 21st, 1986. Yes, I'm a believer in both categories. I feel everything is possible. Many of our man-made UFOs are unfunded opportunities. He underlined UFO, and unfunded opportunities. In both categories, there are lots of kooks and charlatans, so be careful. Best regards, Ben Rich. Here it is. Explosive. Dispositive. Now, he, again, would not have had a complete all-access pass into every compartment, extraterrestrial and man-made, because the intelligence officer that we have recently interviewed confirmed that the area at Nellis Air Force Base that dealt with man-made advanced UFO-type anti-gravity was completely separate from and hermetically sealed from the extraterrestrial facility underground that was run by people, not ETs, but that had the ET craft they were studying. We've also had it confirmed that the very famous Cash Landrum case, how many people have heard of this? In the early 80s, and there was a craft outside Houston that had a core breach and was spewing radioactive material and injured and killed a couple of women. And it looked like a saucer, and it was flying, and they had to call in helicopters to assist, and it made a crash landing in a remote area. This Air Force Office of Special Investigations official, on camera, admits that he was the principal investigator that, for the Air Force, put out the cover story that it was a UFO, And he said it was one of ours, but the skin of the craft, the shell, was extraterrestrial. The power plant, which they had not been able to fully figure out, had a hybrid system that had a nuclear power component that had a filtering problem and a core breach and began to spew radioactivity on people. And this is on camera. This is a lieutenant colonel, name, rank, serial number. I'm telling you, this is going to be explosive, this movie, Unacknowledged. So what you need to understand is that the intelligence community is thrilled if the UFO community says it was a UFO, it was all alien, when in reality it's not that simple. It's both. Some of it's ET, some of it's man-made. Some of it's both. And the Cash Landrum crash case was both. So this understanding is key. Otherwise, everyone's going to assume anything that we don't understand that zips around is extraterrestrial. Moreover, anything that would come over and do an Independence Day attack, boom, is extraterrestrial, when it isn't. It is not. It is absolutely not. It's all a lie. It's the biggest hoax in human history, and you've got to wake up to it.